In January 2023, my grandad, George Arthur Oldham, passed away after a long battle with cancer. He was an incredible man and lived a wonderful life. I've been frightened of death ever since I was a kid, and I've been incredibly lucky not to really have experienced much of it so far in my life. I knew it was coming, and it's followed me round like a shadow. My granddad taught me so many incredible lessons in his life, and he continues to do so in death. And this is my story. So when I was younger, I was really lucky, and I didn't really experience much death. And actually, the first experience of death that I had, and I've told this story about when I was a kid, everything was very black and white. It was probably actually, now I've just said that, it was watching The Lion King and seeing Scar throw Mufasa off the edge of the cliff. That film used to break me, like properly. It used to like massively upset me. I used to get really upset. I used to hide behind the back of a sofa when it was that bit on the film, but I loved the rest of it. I'd still force myself to watch it. But it wasn't until I must have been like maybe 6 or 7, and me and my little brother had got rabbits. And mine was called Thumper, and his was called Giggsy, after Ryan Giggs, because we're Man United fans. And I used to have extra lessons. So I used to have a teacher would come on a Saturday morning, and she'd teach me English, because I really struggled reading and writing when I was younger. So she'd teach me English, and I'd just be finding it incredibly difficult to concentrate, because my brother, my sisters, and my cousins normally were outside playing. And so I'm trying to do these English lessons. And then this one day, after one of my English lessons, my mum comes in, and she's looking like dead sad, and she says, "Sam, I'm really sorry. Your rabbits died." And I was like heartbroken. I was like, "What do you mean?" And the funny story about the amazing story about this says a lot about my little brother. I only found this out a few years ago, but my brother took the rap for this for my cousin. And basically they were playing with a load of bricks, and the rabbits ran behind the back of the hutch. The bricks have fallen over and the rabbits died. And my brother took the rap for it and said it was him that did it, and it was never him. And he held on to that for like 20 years. So that says a lot about my brother. But I was completely heartbroken. I was floored. I was so upset. My mum said I could go out and get a new rabbit, but it was never the same. And that was really my first experience of death. And I was so upset, man. I just really couldn't understand it. I couldn't understand that, my rabbit was gone, and I was still really young. And it was a few years later that I had my next experience, and the next one was a family member. It was my great-grandma, my grandma Bez. She was a big character on my mum's side. So she was my mum's mum. And I used to go every Wednesday, especially, I used to be ill a lot when I was a kid. I don't know why. Maybe now, looking back, it was because I was doing so much training in the gym, but I've always had quite a weak immune system, and I used to quite often be off school on a Wednesday at home watching cartoons, my mum giving me fizzy Lucozade and grapes, and we'd go over to look after my nana Bez, and she used to live in a care home towards the end, I think, near, was it a care home? Or she lived in a home in Ratcliffe-on-Trent, so we'd go over there every Wednesday, and she'd always give me, she used to save her 20p's up, and she'd give me like a big plastic, it was almost like a Smarties plastic can that you'd get Smarties in, of 20p's, and she'd give me the change. I used to think it was amazing. I used to think it was like treasure. So I loved my nana Bez, and she was always around when we were kids, because my mum's side of the family in particular, we spent every spare minute we had together. We grew up together. We did everything together. We'd go on days out together. If it was a summer holidays or Christmas holidays, I'd see my cousins every single day. My mum used to look after my cousin a lot because she was the same age as my brother. So yeah, when my nana Bez passed away, that was really hard. And I can remember she was in a care home at the end, and my mum had asked me, like, "Sam, do you want to go and see your nana Bez?" They were aware that it was towards the end of her life. I wasn't very old. I was maybe around 10 years old, I think. So I went to this care home, and my mum said, "Oh, come on, Sam, you can come in." And I went in, and she was incredibly ill. She was very poorly, and it wasn't nice. That stuck with me forever. It was like every time I closed my eyes, I'd see it. That wasn't my grandma anymore. So I can remember I went in, my mum kind of realised that was not a good idea, took me out, and there was a little garden, and I can just remember going outside and finding a football and just smacking a football around on my own for like an hour, and then my mum took me home, and I just didn't like that. We didn't talk about it afterwards, but that stuck with me, I think, and that really had a profound impact on me. And then it wasn't until 3 years later that my mum's dad, my granddad Eric, passed away, and this one was hard. I was 13, so I was a teenager. I was starting to be a bit more aware about life, and You know, the concept of death was something that I'd spoke about, I think, in RE in school. And, you know, I was just more conscious of the world around me, I think, and myself and my thoughts. And I'd gone on a training camp to Turin. So I'd gone to Italy, super excited for this training camp. My granddad had cancer, so he had been a smoker his whole life. He'd quit, he'd stopped, and then the cancer got him like that. And he didn't have very long, my granddad. It all happened really fast. And he was a massive part of my life. I never saw him as much as I did my granddad Arthur, but he was always there. And one thing I always remember is that he was so proud of me for doing gymnastics. The year before he passed away, I'd been to my first international representing Great Britain, and he had my dad had made him the DVD copy, and he had it there, and he'd watch it all the time, you know, and he was super proud of me. And when he was ill, I'd given him my gold medal from the British Championships that year, my under-12 British Championship gold medal. It was my medal I was the most proud of, and I gave it to him to kind of give him a bit of strength and inspiration. And I went away on this training camp to Italy, had an amazing time. It was brilliant, loved it. Went to Pisa, Florence, trained for 10 days in the sun. It was amazing. I met all these new gymnasts that became friends later on in my career. But when I came back and I landed, when we got in the car, I could kind of sense something wasn't right. My mum told me that my granddad had passed away while I was away, and they didn't want to tell me because they didn't want to upset me or ruin the trip. And that was really, really hard. I found that difficult. Because, you know, at 13, I'd felt like I'd not really had a chance to get to know him yet. But again, I think at that age, you certainly don't experience it like your parents do, and you're very much shielded from that pain in many ways. I can remember at the time when I was a kid, I used to love Warhammer, and there's Warhammer World in Nottingham, and I spend all of my money on it. And every birthday and Christmas, my dad would buy me these big Warhammer sets. That's all I ever wanted. And I was never very good at painting them. And I think looking back now, this goes back to me not being great at finishing tasks. I'd always make them, half paint them and never finish it. And I put my favourite Warhammer, my mum had said that you can put something in the coffin. So I put my best Warhammer in the coffin, and, you know, it was really sad. They played really sad music. I was a massive Elvis fan. I can remember him playing Elvis, but it was really blurry, you know, and I was shielded, like I said, from a lot of it. And then the years rolled on, and after that, I didn't really experience much death. And I don't think it was probably until the age of 25, which again, I think 25 was a real pivotal age for me. You know, a lot of stuff started to happen, and, you know, it makes sense. The science backs that up. I think, you know, the human brain typically is fully formed around the age of 25. And I remember walking into the gym one day with one of my best friends, Matt Hennessy, and he was telling me that his grandma was ill. I can remember saying to him, yeah, we're getting to that age, Matt, and, you know, I've actually been thinking about it quite a lot recently. I've been very lucky. I've not experienced much death. And prior to that, 2006 had been when my granddad passed away, you know, and I can remember it almost feeling like it was following me around, like it was an elephant in the room that was always there. I knew, right, as I get older, there's no way I'm going to be able to keep going through life without my loved ones disappearing. That's going to happen. That's part of life, and it really frightened me. It scared me a lot. So I had this in my head for a few years, and, you know, I was going through my mental health issues at that time, and I think it wasn't until a couple of years later, around 2018, that my granddad Arthur, he retired finally at the grand old age of 78. So he was still climbing roofs at 78. Building. He was larger than life, an incredible person, massive character, you know, world famous in Keyworth. And you know, it was funny when I was younger, when I started getting some success, I would go to these award dinners after the Olympics, and I'd go there, and people would come up to me, and they wouldn't say, "Oh, Sam, it's nice to meet you." They'd say, "Your name's Oldham. It's your granddad, Arthur Oldham." And it just blew me away. And there was a running joke that wherever we'd go, he'd know someone. Even if we went to Cornwall or we went on holiday, he'd always spot someone that he knew, and it was normally through football. And at this age of 78, he retired, and me and my brother and my dad, we went to this retirement dinner, and all the lads that he'd worked with over the years were there, and I was chatting to them all. And I think over the next 2 years, he really struggled with retirement. And looking back now, and knowing what I know, and spending those 10 months living with him, I think he was so excited when I asked him if I could move in with him because he was so bored and he didn't know what to do, and he just wanted a friend, a partner in crime to do things with. And he was fully on board, literally from the second. He was like, I'll talk to your grandma. Because I kind of had two options. It was either go live with my parents, which was kind of a natural, normal thing to do. But at the time, my brother was there. There wasn't really space for me. In my head, I felt like going back to my mum and dad's was like a step backwards. But somehow going to my grandparents wasn't two steps backwards. It was okay. And he said, yeah, Sam, you can move in with us. You can stay in your Uncle Mitch's room, his old room. So I moved in with my grandparents and he loved it. But what I noticed very quickly was that he wasn't necessarily dealing with retirement very well. And I've told this story before, but there was this one day where he'd asked me to go and make him a cup of tea. And he'd always say to my grandma, is it a desert in here, Jenny? And that would mean he wants a cup of tea. So I'd go off, made him a cup of tea, and he'd always have a cup of tea with one in a tremble or two in a tremble. And so I'd go in, make him his cup of tea. I came back and he was like crouched down on the floor, like peeking over the windowsill. Bearing in mind, I think he was 80 at this point. I'm like, Grandpa, what are you doing? And he said, I'm hiding. I was like, from who? And he was like, the neighbours. I was like, why? And he said, because they'll think I'm not working. And I was like, you're not working? And he was like, well, they don't know that, do they? So he's hid from the neighbours, like walking past. And I was like, it's starting to clock. Okay, there's something not quite right here. But the one thing that I've noticed as well in my life, like so far, with whether it be me, whether it be my friends, or whether it be someone retiring, anybody that's gone through a difficult time and has maybe used, whether it's a substance, whether it's training, whether it's work as a coping mechanism, what I'm starting to figure out is that it's not when you stop that damage that you've been doing to yourself hits you. And I guess the compounding effect of all those years of working on a building site until the age of 78, it seems to be like 3, 6, 12, 18 months later, once you stop, you rest, your body gets used to your new normal, that it then seems to hit you. This happened with my granddad. I'm convinced my other granddad, my granddad Eric, he smoked his whole life, stops, and literally within the space of, between 6 and 12 months, he was diagnosed with lung cancer. And with me, it wasn't necessarily when I first initially went into therapy and spoke to the therapist for the first time that it really hit me. It was when I had actually, in many ways, got a lot better and switched my approach to life and wasn't being so extreme and was enjoying things. And I went into that lockdown, and that's when it hit me the hardest, and I've noticed that. And that was certainly the case with my granddad. And I think, I learned so much about him during that time. I certainly learned that retirement is a difficult thing to navigate. And I knew that in a few years' time, that's what I was going to experience. I was really lucky because I was able to watch someone and witness firsthand them retire at the end of their life. And I knew that I was going to retire soon, but I would have the rest of my life ahead of me. So I was super fortunate that I could see that and watch how he navigated that process and how difficult he found it. I think the other thing as well that really struck me with my granddad was that for those 10 months I was living with him, he was in extreme pain all of the time. And he would never sleep. And this was during a period of my life where I was in a lot of pain with my neck. I was in agony. I was going through my mental health stuff. So I was kind of focusing on that. And he would say it every day to me and my grandma and my dad when he saw him, and my uncle. He would say, I'm in so much pain with my back. I can't sleep. And, I just thought it was old age. And it's funny, I don't think I really ever listened to him when he was telling me how much pain he was in. And he was going to the doctors all the time and telling them this, and it was like they didn't believe him. For literally for a year, he was saying, I'm in agony with my back, and they did scans on his back and stuff, but nothing was ever picked up. It was kind of like, okay, you do have a problem there, because he broke his back when he was a younger man. So actually, I never found this out until a few years ago, but he was doing a training session. I think it was with Notts County, and he was on at the Old Meadow Lane, I think he was on a squash court type surface, one of those shiny school hall surfaces where you play basketball, and someone had mopped it up, and he'd hit a wet patch and gone straight into the wall and broke his back. And so they just kind of said it was that, he was old, that was giving him a lot of pain, but I could see it wasn't right. But I'm dealing with my own stuff. I'm thinking, I'm saying the right things to him. I'm saying, Grandpa, listen to the doctors. They know if they're telling you there's nothing there. But he knew he had that gut instinct, And yeah, that's really stuck with me. Like, if you always listen to somebody's eyes. That's why it's been so hard the last few years, and it's why I'm really bad on my phone, is because I'm terrible at sending messages on WhatsApp and like iMessage or even phone call. Phone calls are all right, and then FaceTime's better, right? But I want to be there with someone. I want to see their eyes, see their emotion, like really see what they're feeling at that time. And like when he was telling me this stuff, I probably wasn't looking close enough, I couldn't see the desperation in him, that gut feeling he had. In his head, he was like, nobody believes me, but I'm in so much pain right now. And so that was pretty hard. And then, it was the first week of the lockdown. And he'd just had his 80th birthday. So, I'd spent those 10 months with him. I'd found out that his name wasn't actually Arthur, it was George, which blew my mind. So I'd known my granddad my whole life. And it wasn't until the first week I was living with him, these letters were getting addressed to my grandma and my granddad's house. And I'm like, nosy. So I'm looking at these letters and it's saying George Oldham. After about a week, I'm like, no, who's George Oldham? And she laughed and she went, that's your granddad. I went, what? She was like, yeah, his name's George. I was just like, what do you mean his name's George? I've known him for 27 years. It's Arthur. Like, I've never heard anyone call him George, but in his family, for some reason, his parents, they referred to all of their children by their middle names. And my granddad's middle name was Arthur. So he was just Arthur, even though his real first name was George. So I was like, right, brilliant. So I told everybody that for a week. I lived off that story for like a month. I still tell people now. So I found all this out in those 10 months and some incredible things about his life, about my family's life that I would have never known. So found out about his dad and his mom, so my great-grandparents, and the farm, how that started, how he got into football, his first jobs, all of this amazing stuff that you would never find out unless you spent real quality time with someone. And at the end of those 10 months that I lived with him was his 80th birthday. So we had this big party at a restaurant just outside the village. We all went. It was an amazing occasion. He was on fine form. He actually sang to everybody. And I was like, I could see my nana like putting her hand on her head. We were all laughing. It was brilliant. And afterwards we went to the pub. Sergey came along. Loads more people came. Amazing day. We got loads of amazing photos of it. And that was looking back now, that was a really special day because, on the Monday of that weekend, we were going into lockdown. That happened. And I was also moving into my parents' house. I was moving back out my grandparents' house. My brother Jack had basically flown to Australia in February to live out his dream playing football abroad. He'd signed for a team in Australia. My granddad was super excited about that because my granddad was one of the 10-pound Poms that went over in the 60s and he went out there to play football and my dad was born there. So super excited for Jack, and it meant that I could now nick Jack's bedroom. So I moved back in with my mum and dad. And yeah, literally 1 week into the lockdown, my mum and dad told me that he'd been diagnosed with cancer, and that was probably the hardest, I think, that point, in many ways. And don't get me wrong, there were times after that were really difficult, but yeah, I didn't take that well at all. And I think the issue was my coping mechanism was gone. My coping mechanism for the majority of my life has been to train. If something goes wrong, what's the one thing I can do to forget about the world? It's go to the gym, and I'm in complete control of that. So, and that was out of the window because I was doing lockdown training. So I had all these hours in the day to think about this thing, and I'm an overthinker at the very best of times, let alone when something like that's happened and you're stuck at home, you're on your phone all day scrolling. It was difficult. And I rang my brother up and I broke the news to my brother and told him, which was quite hard. But I just felt at that point, me and Jack were really close. And he was like, in many ways at that time, Jack was like he was my rock to lean on. So I rang him and told him, and it was like this thing that we could kind of like share together because, me and Jack had a real unique relationship with my granddad. We were incredibly close to him. he was just a huge part of our life through football, but also just, anything golf. I can remember one of the best Christmas presents we ever had. He bought us golf clubs, both of us, and we were so excited, man. There's a videotape of it, my face is just beaming. And so that was one thing, that we had a relationship with my granddad and each other through golf. That was another beautiful thing that we used to do. We used to go and take him to play golf all the time, and he was a great golf player. And he only started playing golf when he was 50, I think, which is incredible. So he had this horrible swing. It was awful. But he somehow would always get the job done, and he'd always beat us. So yeah, I told Jack, and yeah, that was tough. But dealing with that over the lockdown was hard, And because I couldn't go and see him, that was tough. Because he was now essentially he had to self-isolate, and he was one of the most vulnerable people, being diagnosed with myeloma. So it's a blood cancer. And, we're getting new information every few weeks, and they're telling us what that means, what that entails. Obviously, you want to ask the difficult questions. You want to say, well, how long's he got? Can this be cured? Is he going to have chemo? So you start to learn all these things, and you slowly get drip fed this. It's almost like it's a step-by-step process that leads to the inevitable, I think. And I think why I found it so hard initially is because, whenever you get told that, and you as a human being, you put the pieces together and you think about his age, and you go, right, well, being diagnosed with cancer at the age of 80 is probably not good. He's been in a lot of pain anyway. So yeah, it was tough. And what I did do for a while, I think, was kind of not necessarily run away, but I certainly ran because it was lockdown, and that's all I was doing. I was running, and I put my headphones in, and all I'd do when I was running, I'd think about it, and I'd run past his house, and it'd upset me, and it would make me sad, and yeah, that kind of went on until we could get out of lockdown, and then I'd go stand in his garden and talk to him through the window. We'd open the gap in the window. I'd stand in the garden and talk to him for an hour, him and my grandma. I used to do that quite a lot because at the time, we were still in and out of the lockdowns, and I was walking around the village a lot, walking the dog. And obviously I had built this bond with him, I'd spent 10 months with him. And I got to know him probably better than almost anyone in my family, other than my dad and his brother, I suppose. And he had become very much like my best friend, my soundboard, the person that I would share things with, my worries, my concerns, positive news. He was the guy I'd go to. My granddad was the first person that ever met Connie. I know that I just can't for the life of me think of a one-liner he came out with. And it kills me because all my family were putting together a list of Arthur George Oldham's, all his one-liners. I just couldn't think of the one. There was the first time he saw it come out with a one-liner, and I shook my head and I thought, I can't believe he's just said that. But he was the first person that met Connie, and, he was super excited, and they became friends straight away. He really loved Connie. So that made us super close as well. And I was living in that house when I met her as well. So that always was something that, made me feel a little bit closer to my grandparents. And I really look back at that time when I was going through my mental health issues, and I feel like that's where I was supposed to be at that time. That's where I had to learn that I was ill. And it was almost though my grandparents were one step removed from my parents. I think if I'd been with my parents, they would have been too emotionally involved with what was going on. It would have been a much more difficult thing to navigate. But because they were my grandparents, and they were certainly that generation that you don't talk about your feelings and your emotions or your mental health, they didn't really know how to handle it. They just sat and listened to me, and that was great. I think that's exactly what I needed at that time. And then, the next step was to move in with my parents and really heal, I guess. So yeah, it was, we had that close bond, and that became really difficult during that lockdown to deal with. But once life got back to normal, I then started spending more and more time with him, And I think I had a real moment, and it was probably the end of 2021. Again, that November time, we went into that second lockdown. And I wasn't dealing with my granddad very well. And I'd just retired. I'd just moved into my first house. This was happening with my granddad. I wasn't sure where I fit in with the world. And I can remember having a moment where, I look back to that conversation I had with that lad Max in the gym, where he kind of said, just accept the worst. And so then I don't really expect much more. And then after that, anything's a bonus. And I was starting to piece these things together. And when I retired, I went to have a conversation with my old team captain, Christian Thomas, and I sat there with him for like 3 hours. It was brilliant. I used him as like a soundboard and he just listened to me. You know, he could tell, I think, I was a bit lost, didn't know what to do with myself. He's always been someone that's given me some good advice. And he turned around and he said to me, you know, Sam, we had such different careers because, you know, I never expected anything. I never thought I was going to go to the Olympics or be a British champion. So anything I ever did in my life, it was always a bonus. And I thought there's something to that. And, you know, I just got to the point where I was trying to be brave and do things differently and approach my career in a different way. And I thought, I need to approach this in a slightly different way. And I'm so frightened of the inevitable of my granddad passing away that actually I'm wasting this time that I've got to be with him while he's still here and I can still talk to him and I can have quality time with him and make memories and learn about his life and ask him the big questions. So in that November time, I decided I need to accept that my granddad is passing away and he's dying, whether that be 6 months, 12 months, 18 months or 2 years. This is really important for me if I'm going to be able to handle this and deal with it and also like not be scared of going to see him. And so I had that conversation with myself, which was pretty hard. But after that, do you know what? It was so much easier. And for the rest of that time that my granddad was ill, I just went to spend time with him, be with him. And I loved it. And in 2022, you know, I would spend every Wednesday morning with him if I could. And if not, I'd switch the days around. But I would go and I'd sit with him for 3 hours. And it meant that my grandma could go to the gym. She's a member of David Lloyd and she's been a member there for like a whole life. And my granddad and my grandma would go there together most of the time. And my granddad would basically just sit in the cafe, stopping people walking past to have conversations with them. They must have used to think, oh God, it's this guy again, because he could talk for England. But so she'd go and do that and I'd sit with him and we'd just talk and we'd watch cowboy films and, you know, I'd put different films that I'd watched or football films on or different YouTube videos because he didn't know how to work YouTube and stuff, or I'd show him stuff I'd done with Sam or videos of my competitions or training, or I'd tell him what I'd been up to and I'd just tell him about my life and I'd ask him the big questions, you know, and I'd ask him all about his life and everything and his regrets, the things he enjoyed, what he looks back on, whether time goes quickly, like what he would do differently, you know, like I would ask him all of that stuff. And yeah, those last 18 months were just amazing. They were incredible. I got so much out of that. And you know, as 2022 went on and I spent that time with him, the one thing I was quite nervous about was I knew that me and Connie were going to go traveling. And, you know, initially we'd planned to go for about 6 or 7 months. And I thought, 6 or 7 months, that's a long time. What's the worst thing that's going to happen while I'm away? My granddad's going to pass away and I'm not going to get a chance to say goodbye. You know, and that was, while I was traveling, that was my biggest fear. And I never really said it out loud. Connie was well aware of it, you know. And Connie's great because Connie's experienced some death in her life, and so she was a really good person to be able to like talk to, lean on as a friend, you know, for advice during this period of time when my granddad was ill. You know, and the time was ticking on while I was traveling. I'd ring him, I'd talk to him on the phone. It was harder because it was a different time zone all the time, and my grandma's not great with FaceTime and stuff, but I would do it. And, you know, once we made the decision to come home early, me and Connie, I was really happy with that. And I know that they were frightened. They were really worried about me being unsafe travelling because they'd been watching Simon Reeve, like, travelling across South America. And my grandma was going, "You're not going there, are you? You're not going to Bolivia? It's really dangerous in Bolivia." And I was like, "We're in Bolivia right now. I'm just going to tell her I'm somewhere else." And so all the time she was just like, they were petrified of me, like, getting into trouble. I was saying, "No, it's fine. It's not a problem." I wouldn't tell them about the ropey situations we were getting ourselves into. But I was just telling them about the fun stuff. And my granddad's face would light up when I tell him these stories. And once we decided we were coming home at Christmas, I was just kind of praying, like, come on, like, it's going to be fine. And I wouldn't really think about it, you know. And yeah, when we got home, and I went and surprised my mom and dad first. So it was oh God, what an adventure trying to get home. It was a nightmare. We'd left Cancun, like we'd had to like pretend that we weren't coming home. And we knew that if we didn't come home on Christmas Day, it would throw everyone. So we made this arduous journey back home. My sister helped us, gave us a lift, dropped us at Connie's mum and dad. We surprised Connie's mum and dad, went back to my house, surprised my mum. My mum was all over the place. And then I was like, right, the next day, we'll do grandparents, right? So we went over, surprised my grandma on my mum's side. my nana Yvonne, and then we went to surprise my granddad. I've told this story on the travelling one, but it's like my favourite story ever. And I'll knock on the door. Grandma comes to the door, can't see what's going on. She turns the light on, she's like, oh, it's Sam. And then she lets me in, put my head round the door, and he's like lying in the fetal position on the sofa. I come in, just bursts into life. And like the thing he did was, like I'll never forget, because like my dad's side of the family, they don't hug, and I've never seen my dad hug or kiss his mum or like, I've never seen that. But I'm quite comfortable sometimes I shock people and I'm just like, I'll just hug you. And then you can't get out of it. I do it to my sisters and I can see them like not knowing what to do. But my granddad grabbed me and he pulled me in. And to say he was so ill, he held me so tight, almost like in a headlock, my head touching his head. And he held me for like 30 seconds. And it was like, yeah, I just felt so connected to him in that moment, you know, and I could just tell he was just happy I was home and I was safe. And I sat there in front of him for the next half an hour, telling him all my stories, his face beaming. He was just so happy that I was home. I know that he had missed our conversation, you know, and I'd missed it too. I'd missed telling him all about my life in person, sitting with him on a Wednesday morning. And, you know, the plan was to go back to normal. I was going to go back to doing that. And I think, you know, I went round one day again on the Wednesday, and then it was like in between, the gap between Christmas and New Year, and I'd bought my sister a birthday present from like John Lewis in town. And on this day, like, it was a really busy day. Like, loads just seemed to have happened on this one day. And I'd gone to the gym early in the morning. I'd just started going to the gym with Josh. So we just started our German volume training. So I'd gone to the gym, and as I'm walking out, I'm thinking in my head, I think it was a Thursday. I wonder if I'd see my granddad and my grandma, because they come in sometimes. And just like that, he turns the corner and he starts walking towards me. I can remember thinking, you don't look well. What are you doing here? I can remember thinking that. His like eyes were pretty like sunken into his head. He just didn't look well that day. And my grandma was going to Aqua. And I know what they used to do. I completely get it. They wanted to get out of the house and live like normal. And they really did. I said to my grandma recently, those 3 years that he had cancer, you guys lived and you did things. And I think that's the best way to do it. And I don't think either of them would ever have changed it. And he came towards me, and I had a phone call with my best friend that morning at like 9:30. And I said, Grandpa, I've got a phone call with Will, but I'll ring him and I'll tell him and I'll sit down with you for 20 minutes. And I sat there with him in David Lloyd and we had a chat, and he was asking about my life, and he was worried about my dad. He was worried about my dad and his work. And I was putting his mind at ease and telling him, Grandpa, he's a grown man now. He can sort this out. Don't worry about him. You know, because he really did like love my dad and his brother so much. All he ever did when I was with him was talk about him. And I put him, and he said, yeah, you're right, Sam, you're right. And I was like, right, Grandpa, you going to be all right? He's like, yeah, I'll have a coffee. I'll talk to some people. And I said, well, I'm going to go and, you know, talk to Will on the phone, and then I'll come and see you next week, okay? He said, yeah. So I went off and left him. And then my plan was to go into town, because this present I bought for my sister was the wrong one. It didn't work. It was missing like the charger, I think. So I was going to drive into town to get it changed. This was a Thursday afternoon, didn't have any work or anything. And I went round to my mum's briefly, said I'd saw my granddad, he doesn't look that well. Left my mum's to drive into town. And I'm so lucky that all of my family live in Keyworth. I've got my mum and my dad and both sets of grandparents in the village, and my brother now as well. So I've left. I've gone about a minute out of my mum's house, and she's rang me. I don't know why I picked up, because I didn't have my hands free on, which is not all right. So I picked it up and put it on speaker, and my mum went, Sam, your granddad's had a fall. Can you get round there now? So I've literally turned the car at the next junction, drove there, got there fast, pulled my car up, legged it upstairs. Their backside door is always open. I probably shouldn't say that on this. So I just opened it, legged it upstairs, and my granddad's lying like this on my grandma. And so I've seen this and like panicked. And I've said, what's happened? And she said, he's fell. So he's fell out of standing up at the toilet, fell backwards. And I'm going, he's hit his head on the door frame. So I get my grandma out the way, I lie him on me, and then I take him onto the bed. And like, you know, he's light, he's very ill, but he's still a heavy guy. But I get him God, if you could have watched how I did it, it was probably the most unconventional, worst way of doing it ever. I laid him on top of me. So he was lying on top of me and then shuffled him to the side. I was thinking, God, I do such odd things sometimes. But I've got him on the bed. I'm sitting him up. 10 minutes later, my dad comes. My dad's here. I'm like, Dad, I think he's hit his head. I think we need to like call the doctors. My grandma's had a stroke, so we'd done a stroke test on him. It all looked fine. He was responding pretty well to us. And then ring the 111. The ambulance come. They go into the room. I wait downstairs, kind of leave my dad up there and stuff. And they say, yeah, we're going to take him off in the ambulance to hospital. And they take him down the stairs, and then they say, is his left side, I think it was his left side, normally not quite as responsive? And we're like, no, it's normally fine. And we were like a bit confused by that. And I didn't think anything of it. And they sent him off to hospital, and it was just waiting for news, basically. And that night, I'd also planned to go and see my brother. So I went for a pint with my brother to catch up. So this all happened in one day. This is one day, 24 hours. I've ran over, tried to like be there. It's a lot for me to take because, you know, I've just got back from traveling as well a week later. I've not even processed the fact that I've just traveled around 10 countries in 4 months. And I've got home. This has just happened. It's a bit of a blur. And we're just waiting, and I'm chatting to my brother again. You know, it's funny actually. Thinking back now, it's like that first conversation when I rang my brother when he was in Australia to tell him. You know, we're having another conversation in a pub in Keyworth, and we're sat there and we're talking about it again. You know, almost 3 years later. And the next day, I didn't know what to do with myself, so I thought, right, I'm going to go and swap my sister's present that I didn't get done the last time. And we're in John Lewis, and my mum rings me up and tells me he's had a stroke, and I was not ready for that. I can remember sitting on a chair in John Lewis, just crying. And then I kind of got myself together, went and got the present, and then, the next few weeks, he was very ill, bless him, in hospital, and that was a really hard thing to deal with. But I think I'd been preparing for this for a long time. And I know that the people in my family were very concerned about this day and this moment because they were very aware of my mental health issues and that I wasn't probably like the most stable I'd been over the last few years. You know, I certainly wasn't. And, you know, they knew how close I was with him, how much time I'd spent with him. But actually, you know, I'd read half of the book and listened to him a lot over the previous 12 months, a guy called Jordan Peterson. And there's one thing that I like really took, and I thought, that's brilliant, that is. And it was, he has this idea about being the person that somebody can rely on at a funeral. And essentially the idea is that, you know, a funeral is an incredibly difficult thing to do, like to experience, to go through for people. And he basically says that, you know, if you're struggling in your life and you've not got a lot of purpose or meaning and you're feeling a bit lost, one thing that you can do that is incredibly positive and can support other people around you is to be the person that people can lean on at a funeral. And I kind of like read this and it resonated with me because what I was going through with my granddad. I knew this day was going to come, right? And I was like, right, you know, either this is going to completely cripple me or I'm going to prepare for this and I'm going to be the person that some of my family members can rely on at the funeral. And so I was like remembering this in my head as we're going through this process, and he's ill in hospital. And of course, while he's in hospital, I'm not thinking about that in the funeral. I'm praying that he's going to be okay. He's going to make a recovery and, you know, the stroke won't be too bad. And, you know, the first time I went to see him, it's another classic Sam Oldham story, but I get into the ward and it's the first time I'm there. It's like the Sunday after he's gone into the hospital, right? And I get there. I've been given like which ward it is, the number, how to get there. My grandma's petrified of me parking. I'm like, Jenny, don't worry, I'll get a parking spot. I get in there and I walk in and I get to the ward and I say, I'm here to see George Arthur Oldham. And we get in there and my grandma's not there. She's gone to the toilet or something. So he sees me straight away. And he's like, Sam, come over here. So I come over and I get to him and I'm like, you all right, Grandpa, how you doing? He's like, yeah, I'm good. And he's fully cognitive. He's like properly there. He knows who I am. He can see me like at this point. So I'm thinking, great. Oh, this is brilliant. He's going to be fine. And I'm chatting to him for like 2 minutes, telling him what I've been up to. He starts like rubbing his leg. And I'm like, Grandpa, you right? And he's like, I need a wee. I was like, right. And he was like, yeah, I need a wee. I was like, well, what do we do about that? And he said, well, you've got to get that cardboard thing from over there. I was like, right, okay. And like me being me, I just think, right, well, I'll help him have a wee then. So I go and get this cardboard thing that you wee into. There's me, my granddad, me holding it for him in front of the whole ward. Like, he's having a wee and he's struggling to wee. So I'm going, come on, granddad, you can do it. And I help him have a wee. We sort that out. I put it back on the tray table thing. We sit down. Hour and a half later, we've been having these conversations. He thinks he's on the building site, and I'm telling him, look, he's going, Sam, we need a mix on. And I'm going, Jack's doing it. Jack's out the back. He's got a mix on, Grandpa. Don't worry. And he's like, he's slow, innit? I'm like, yeah, he's always slow, but don't worry, he'll get the job done. And so he thinks we're on the building site, and he literally thinks we're like building this wall in the ward. And like an hour and a half later, he says, I need the toilet again. And my grandma goes, well, we'll have to get the nurse and shut the curtains. And I'm like, oh, man. I was like, I thought you do it. I thought it was us that do that, Grandma. She was like, what? I was like, yeah. And I just laughed. And I went and told my dad afterwards, and he was crying. So she goes to get the nurse. They shut the curtains, and the nurse does it, and we stand outside. But I'd just done it in front of everybody, so it was hilarious. So that's one of the funny stories I'll always remember. Just that's typical me and my granddad. But after that, the next few weeks, it kind of was quite a drawn-out process, and he got iller and iller, and towards the end it was really tough, man. It was, in many ways he wasn't the same person, and it was really, really emotionally draining for all of my family. We took it in turns doing shifts, and actually towards the end, like the end of the last week, I got home and I said to my mum, I can't do this anymore. I don't think it's good for me. It's like massively affecting me. I don't think he'd want me to see him like this anymore. And she said, that's okay. And I cried. And then over the next 48 hours, I felt really guilty. I felt like I'd let him down, like I'd given up on him. Like, if I get all the good of him, if I get the good stuff and I get to be with him and I get to learn from his knowledge and share his memories, I should be there, like in the most difficult part of his life, right? It's in life and in death, like in sickness and health. Like, I should be there, but I felt really guilty about it, and I was toying with it in my mind, and I felt like I'd made a mistake. And then my mum rang me and she said, look, Sam, we've been told he's not got long left. Like, we think you should, if you want to come, it's up to you, it's your decision. I said, I'll be there. Like, and I went straight there, and Connie said, I can come with you. And yeah, we just, all of our family, we just spent that time with him that day. And we were there all day, me, my brother, my dad, my mum, my uncle, my auntie, my grandma, my granddad. And yeah, we just sat there telling stories about him and trying to think of all of his one-liners, and it was brilliant. And I actually felt really close to them, and the nurse and the hospital staff were amazing. They really told us what it was going to be like, that he'd be at peace, he wouldn't feel anything, and that helped reassure me a lot. And the most incredible thing, and I've told the story about the yellow butterfly recently, this one was unbelievable. Connie was sat outside the ward. She didn't want to be there, right? She didn't want to be in the ward. She knew that we invited her in, but she knew that was a thing for our family. And she was sat out in the ward, and a girl walked past her. And it's a girl she's not seen since she went to uni years ago. And she went to uni in York, not even in Nottingham. And this girl went, Connie? And she said, hello? And she said, don't you remember me? It's me from university. And she was like, what? She was like, yeah, it's me. And I'm sure her name was Angel or Hope. One of the two names. I have to ask Connie, because I've kind of forgot about that now, because I've tried to, in many ways, I guess, block that whole thing out. And she said, I just wanted to check you're okay, because you look like you're quite sad. And she was like, yeah, my boyfriend's granddad's in there, he's passing away. And she said, okay, well, if you need anything, I'll be around. And the girl walks off. That's it, never saw her again. And Connie's staring there, and there's basically right in front of her, she's been staring at it for hours, there's a fire hose. And on this fire hose, it's got the words George Oldham on it. And she can't believe it. Like, George Oldham. And she's like, what? It's like George Oldham and co. And she tells me, and I'm like, no way. Like, there's no way. Like, that ward, she sat there at that moment, that girl's walked past, and it says George Oldham on it. And then the amazing thing was that a week later, I showed my grandma the picture. And it had my grandma's maiden name on it as well, Orm. I was like, what? And you know, like, I don't know what I believe in. I don't know that I believe in God or the universe or the afterlife or that you're reincarnated. I don't know, all right? But I believe in something. I think we're all connected. And that for me was like it was almost a sign that it was going to be okay. And he managed to fight on throughout the night. And I've got to say, my granddad, I tell you what, for a small man, he was tough. He had myeloma, prostate cancer, pneumonia, a heart attack, and a stroke, plus all of his other ailments. He had arthritis. Both his cuffs and his shoulders were gone, completely disintegrated. And he fought for 3 years, that man. Like, talk about inspiration. Like, what a guy. And I'm not surprised because he was larger than life. And the next morning, you know, I was asked if I'd go around to my grandma's house, and they were having, of all things, a bit of normality, right? A guy was coming to check the boiler. And she didn't want to miss the appointment. She'd been waiting ages. And I said, right, I don't think this really matters with what's going on, but I'll go round. And so I'm racing because I'm terrible with time management. Sam will tell you I'm always 5 minutes late. So I'm racing to get there because I'm 5 minutes late and he could arrive between 9 and 10. I'm shutting the door. My mum rings me and I answer it, and I'm like, casually answer it. And she says, Sam, your granddad's passed away. And I was like, what? And I stopped and I didn't know what to do. And I said, it's okay. I'll ring you back. I'm going to get to the house and make sure that, you know, the guy comes to check the boiler. And it was really weird, man. You know, I was in that house on my own, all those memories, like with my granddad and my grandma and that time I'd spent with him. And the most incredible thing, like this for me was something, you know, like nobody could argue with me. I pulled up, and as I got out of the car, his house was covered in birds, covered in them. There was pigeons, robins. I've got a picture of it. And he had this blackbird he used to feed every morning. The blackbird was on the roof. And as I walked up to the house, they all flew off. And I just felt at peace, man. I don't know whether that's a real thing or not, but I just felt like, you know, I was happy that he was now at peace. And yeah, the guy came to do the boiler. He went away and I just sat in the lounge on my own. I sat in that chair that spins around, which is perfect for me because I'd never sit still. I'd always be spinning on it. And he'd be sat in that sofa and I just sat there and I just thought about him and then got my stuff together, locked up the house. And then, yeah, it was, the next few days were hard, man. When Connie got back, I think Connie was at work, I got really upset and I cried and I wailed, man, like a child, you know. And she was upset. She'd never seen me like that. But it was good. I'd learned through my mental health battle in the last few years that, like, it's not good for me to hold it in. I have to feel my emotions and let it out, you know? And I did that. And in many ways, maybe like me going through my stuff was to help me. I do think everything in life happens for a reason, and everything I've been through got me to that point so I could handle that, you know, and that experience is going to help me handle ones in the future. I know that in years to come, when my dad and his brother were sat around, that's going to be me one day, and my brothers and sisters. So, you know, in many ways, I was trying to I wanted to experience this. I wanted to know what it was like, because that's going to be 100 times harder when that day comes for me, you know? And I want to be able to help my kids one day, if I'm lucky enough to have them, when they're in that situation. So it was important for me to feel it and see what it was, understand death, especially because I had that deep-rooted fear of it. And then, yeah, it was quite a long period up until the funeral. And, you know, I had been asked to speak at the funeral. I knew that question was coming. I'd prepared myself for this as well. You know, I mentioned before I chose not to speak at his 80th birthday, and after that I kind of regretted it and thought, you know, if I get asked again to do something like that, I'll definitely do it. And it was interesting. Connie had sent her dad round to my house, And me and Connie's dad get on really well, and he's an incredible man. And Connie had sent him round to basically check up on me because she was worried about my mental health, and she was worried about how I was dealing with my granddad, and just there was an awful lot going on in my life right at that point outside of just my granddad. And he basically said, I've heard, Sam, that you've been asked to talk at your granddad's funeral. And I said, yeah, it's quite hard. Like, no one's really given me any advice or told me what to talk about. I don't really know what to do. I know that I don't have to do it. But I know that my dad's just, that's not my dad. Like, he won't want to do that, and it's not the right thing for him to do that. I said, I know I'll be good at it, but yeah, it's really tough. I don't know how to go about it. And he said, well, I've done it. I did it once. And he said, I was really nervous. I didn't want to do it. But the one thing I would say to you is that if you choose to do it, just remember that after I did it, I was really happy that I had done that. And actually, it was a way for me to get some closure. So I listened to those words, and I decided I was going to do it. This was me being the person to rely on at a funeral. This was the thing I could do on that day that would help the people around me. And I almost treated it like my job. This is my job. I'm going to do this. This is important to me. And he would want me to do it. And I sat and wrote it out. Writing it out was the hardest thing. I was sitting there, just floods of tears, man, just writing this thing out. And then I'd practice it like a little bit because I needed to know how long it was going to be, because I know that I have a tendency to keep waffling on for ages, and I didn't want to do that at his funeral. I wanted it to be right, so I kind of like timed it and got a rough idea, but it was really hard to even do that. So once I felt like I got it down, I just left it, put it in my pocket. And the day of the funeral was tough. I had gone out. My granddad was famous for always dressing to the nines. So I had always said when it's my granddad's funeral, I'll make sure I'm wearing a shiny pair of shoes. And he used to wear Cuban heels, and he would only get his Cuban heels from a shop in Southport. That was my granddad. So he'd drive all the way to Southport near Liverpool to buy his Cuban heels from this one shoemaker. Never told me why. So I thought, I'm going to buy a brand new pair of shoes. So I bought a brand new pair of black shoes that I'll be able to keep for years to come. They're beautiful. Because he always used to appreciate good clothes. He was a teddy boy back in the day. And I bought a brand new white shirt, and we went along. My mum picked me up. It was tough. I knew that my granddad had had such a positive impact on so many people's life that there were going to be a lot of people there. But when we started to get close to the church, and there were just cars parked up on the banks, and we got there, and no one ever explains to you the process. I knew that I was going to be a coffin bearer with my brother, my dad, and his brother. But no one tells you how it's going to go. And I was really hoping that I'd get to do my eulogy first. And so I got there, my uncle was there. Obviously my uncle and my dad are really struggling to hold it together. And I said, Uncle Mitch, who's going first? And he says, I'm going to go first. And I thought, oh no. I wanted to get it done and get it out of the way first. But I'm thinking, that's fine. Just remember, it's okay. Everybody there is with you. And, the people that are there, the funeral service, tell us how to carry the coffin, and we walk the coffin in. And me and my dad are at the front, and my brother and my uncle are at the back because we're the shortest. And me and my dad have got 2 left feet, so they were telling us to walk at the right time. And my dad, I'm going, Dad, and he's walking wrong foot. And so we're all over the place, and it's wonky. But there's people outside of the church that can't get into the church. And as we turn the corner and we're in the hallway of the church just to go in, I can just see the people, and it's 7 or 8 people strong from the back of the church forwards. And there's friends and people Andy had flown from Ireland to be there. That's the type of impact that my granddad had on one of my friends' lives. And there were friends that I'd played football with when I was a kid. All my brother's friends were there. People from everywhere, all over the village, people from football, and it was, instead of being crippled by the moment, it just gave me energy, man. It just filled me up with pride. My granddad had such an amazing life that this many people want to show their respect. And we walked in, we put the coffin down, and we sat down, and I think it actually turned out to be the most amazing thing that my uncle went first, because from his speech. I knew that mine was going to be okay. It was the right thing because I had no idea how to kind of like do it. I'd never written anything like that. It's the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, for sure. And he went first and he made me laugh, and everyone in the room was laughing, and he was just talking about my granddad, and I realised that all this is going to be is a conversation between me and my granddad. And yeah, it was the hardest thing I've ever done. Connie's mum had given me a really great piece of advice. She said, don't make eye contact with anybody in the first few rows. So your family, just look at the back of the room. So I tried to do that, just stared straight to the back of the room, and I talked as if I was just talking to him. You know, it was one of our Wednesday morning conversations, and it was just me and him in the room, nobody else. And it really did afterwards. I'm so glad I did it. It did give me that closure, I think, and it was an incredible service, man. It was like a celebration. It really was a celebration of his life. I've not been to many funerals. I can't imagine that many of them are like that. My auntie played You'll Never Walk Alone on the cello. We're Man United fans, but my uncle played with Jerry and the Pacemakers, and my granddad was super proud of that. And so that was beautiful. It really was. And it's true. Like, I believe that he's with me and we're with him. And they also, apparently, my grandma had told me a story about one morning she'd gone in when he was really